So today's talk is entitled The Potential Therapeutic Benefits of Psychedelic Drugs. What's the fuss? Now, I want to start with a disclaimer, which is that A, I'm not a therapist, and B, I don't really know anything about psychedelic drugs apart from what I'm about to tell you. This is a completely new area for me. It is something that has been brought about because of an interest in certain members of my team. And so I'm just about half a baby step ahead of you. But I hope that my ability to process the scientific information and tell you the story from a scientific and psychological perspective will tell you why there is a fuss about psychedelic drugs. So just to start with some housekeeping, you will be watching this on Facebook, so I'd really appreciate it if you gave your likes on there. And any comments that you have during the talk, please do post them on there. And questions. This is because at the end of the talk, which will be about 40 to 50 minutes, I will take questions that I will take the questions that have been sent in and answer them. You can send them in right now if you want, but they'll be answered at the end. They're being harvested by my team of helpers, so just send them in when you want. If you're a tweety person, then we'd like you to tweet about this, and there's my Twitter handle, and if you hashtag the brain guy. We are also at Art Talks. One of my team will add the Twitter handle for that for my team as well in the chat. As you know, or some of you know, I've been giving these talks for a while now, and this is actually the third series of talks, and this is talk number 18. The previous talks in my series have been uploaded to a YouTube channel. So if you're interested in hearing my previous talks, then if you YouTube Dr. Ashraf Jansari Neuro Online Talks, you will find my channel. And if you subscribe to it, which is completely free, you will get a notification every time a new talk comes on. I'd like to start with my usual welcome to all the people around the world that are listening in, and we still haven't had anyone emailing us to say my country isn't represented. I'm going to assume that we're being inclusive. So if your country isn't represented here, then do let us know, because we want to make sure that you are. And I think we're going to get some new people soon, because Graham Pluck's laboratory is going to be starting up in Thailand. So we're going to get new people from Thailand joining us at some point, I hope. So welcome. Now, I always start my talks with my thanks to my team, because I need everyone to be aware that this is thanks to my team. But this time I'm going to have extra special thanks, and they're to these three people. Andrea Chebat, who is a former master's student, Oscar Nocton, who is my knight in shining armor, who sorts out the IT stuff, and Francesco Innocenti. Now, the reason I'm singling out these three wonderful young people is because they're the ones who are the inspiration behind this talk. Andrea first brought the issue of psychedelic drug therapy to my attention last summer, and gave a really interesting talk to my group, which most of us had never heard of this issue. And so some of the material I'm going to show you is what Andrea had gathered. Then Oscar, who's my IT guru, he's just a first-year student. He hasn't even finished the first year of his degree, and yet he's so passionate about this area. And he gave a talk to my team on Wednesday, and a lot of what he talked about is also included in my talk. And then finally, Francesco Innocenti, who's a marvelous young Florentine Italian, who has provided some fantastic information to me for this talk as well. So these three young people, they've contributed in terms of content and advice, and they will also be helping me answer questions. So thank you to them. They're obviously also helped by this team that is growing behind me. And I had to actually find a way to show all their faces. So in addition to the three that you've already seen, I want to thank Naonika, Claudia, Priyanka, Anisha, Lucy, Ida, Kim, Denise, Alec, Vitote, Disha, and Dominic. They've all helped in some way or other. They do lots of behind the scenes work to help me gather information, to do the social media outposts, and also to advertise, etc. So I'm very fortunate to have these wonderful young people working with me. So thank you in advance to them. As an overview, what I'm going to try to do is tell you what a drug is, and then what a psychedelic drug is and where they came from, and then what the fuss is about and what caused the reemergence. But most importantly, after I've told you about that, I want to explain why they could be potentially interesting to society and what therapist-assisted drug use would be. And also what we need to be careful of, because this isn't about me selling you a particular therapy. It's about the possibility, but with any possibility, there are also things that we have to be careful of. So the first thing is, what is a drug? Now, that term drug is so emotionally laden in society that lots of people find it a taboo subject. I know it's not related, but at the moment we're getting a lot of the skepticism about vaccines. And vaccines aren't drugs, they're a slightly different thing. But nonetheless, there's a lot of skepticism about certain types of words, and drug is one of them. And this is a term that I found online. A drug is any substance, with the exception of food and water, which when taken into the body, alters the body's function either physically or psychologically. And this is from drugaware.com.au, but it's the standard definition. Drugs can be legal, alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco, or illegal, cannabis, etc. Now, the important thing is that most of you would not have thought of alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco as drugs, that they're drugs. It's just that we're so used to them in our everyday world that we don't consider them to be drugs, but they are stimulants that affect our behavior in exactly the way that the first sentence suggests. And psychoactive drugs affect the central nervous system, and they alter a person's mood, thinking, and behavior. And that's what most people think of when they think about drug use. It's about that altered mood, thinking, but alcohol, etc., does the same stuff. Now, generally, psychoactive drugs can be divided into 4 categories: depressants, stimulants, hallucinogens, and other. Now, I'm not a pharmacologist or a biochemist, so I'm not going to go much into any of this stuff because I don't think the details of the differences about these drugs are actually relevant to us. What I wanted to do is to first of all just give a very brief understanding of how drugs work. And an important thing is why they have an impact. And there's an area in the brain, this is a cross-section across the middle of the brain, called the ventral tegmental area. And through work with animals and lots of other work, we found out that there's this sweet spot, the VTA, which has become known as the reward center. And that reward center is the one that responds to the things that give us pleasure: drink, sex, food, etc. And importantly, because of the exact chemicals in different types of opiates, cannabis, cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, etc. So it's because of the chemistry of these substances, they affect exactly that same area, the reward center. And that reward center is linked to the front of the brain, which to all intents and purposes is the manager of the brain. And it's the one that allows us to decide what to do, whether to do more of something, less of something, do it quickly, do it slowly, etc. So we have the reward center, which is activated by all these things that give pleasure. And we've got the front of the brain, which manages behavior, stops us from doing things, makes us do appropriate things, etc., etc. And generally speaking, the big taboo or the big problem in society tends to be when behavior goes wrong for whatever reasons. And drug addiction is seen as a problem because of the control it takes away from the front of the brain. Now, that's a huge loaded subject in itself. So I don't want to go into it, but I thought it was necessary to explain that that is where the controversy lies, that drugs end up impairing our behavior. Now, to get an understanding of what happens for any drug, whether it's alcohol, nicotine, etc., here's a very simplistic video, and it shows us what happens in the brain between two neurons. And neurons are effectively the cables that transmit information around the brain. And what happens is that you have these tiny little cables called neurons, and they meet at a place called the synapse. And the synapse is like the relay station, like in a relay race where one incoming runner passes the baton on to the outgoing runner. And when that relay has happened, the information can be passed from the first neuron to the second neuron. The first neuron might be telling the second neuron to tell you to get ready to say something. And it needs that relay to happen. So I hope this video works.
Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit signals from a nerve cell. These signals can be passed from one nerve cell to another, from a nerve cell to a muscle cell, or to a gland cell. Neurotransmitters are used by the brain to help regulate breathing, digestion, and even heartbeat. They can also affect other things such as concentration, sleep, and mood. So how do neurotransmitters work? When a nerve cell fires a nerve impulse, neurotransmitters are packaged inside of synaptic vesicles. These synaptic vesicles fuse with the cell membrane and release the neurotransmitters, which cross a fluid-filled gap called the synaptic cleft. These neurotransmitters land on receptor sites of another nerve cell and pass on the nerve impulse. This happens very quickly. More than 100 neurotransmitters have been identified, and some important neurotransmitters include acetylcholine, which is key in activating muscles. Norepinephrine increases heart rate and blood pressure. Dopamine deals with pleasure and rewards. GABA suppresses some types of anxiety. And serotonin, which promotes the sense of well-being and happiness. Chemical messengers that transmit signals from a nerve cell. These signals can be passed from one nerve cell to another, from a nerve cell to a muscle.
Okay, so hopefully you'll have got a bit of an understanding about this relay that happens at this junction between two neurons. And you'll have seen at the end of that video that these neurotransmitters are involved in things like happiness, pleasure, feeling low, etc. Now, any drug will change what's happening in that relay station. Some drugs will slow things down, others will increase it, some of them will block the relay, etc. So all you need to know is that drugs have an impact on that relay system, and they all work in different ways, but the main thing is that they impact that relay. So the thing that's happened over the years is that psychedelic drugs have ended up with a particularly bad rap. And so why has that come about? So just to give you a brief history of popular psychedelics, they've been around for a while. There's a paper that suggests that on rock art from about 6,000 years ago, some of these little depictions that I've highlighted in the blue circle are actually magic mushrooms. Now, we don't know, of course, for certain, but there is a suggestion that our prehistoric ancestors knew about them. There is written evidence of them going back to the 1500s, and when the Spanish went to South America, there was evidence there of different types of psychedelics being used there. So they're not new. LSD itself, which is one of the main drugs I'm going to be talking about, was first discovered in 1938. And it's derived from something called ergot, which is a type of rot from the rye plant. So it's actually a naturally occurring substance. And it wasn't used until 1943 accidentally by someone who's quite well known in this area, Albert Hofmann. Then ketamine, which is another drug that I'll mention, was discovered in 1956. And it was used first as an anesthetic during the 1970s. So we've got magic mushrooms, LSD, and ketamine. And these are the three main psychedelics that I'll mention during this talk. And what happened is that for various reasons, there was extreme popularity of LSD during the 1950s. And what resulted was a careless use of this rather powerful hallucinogen. And you'll see me talk about the effects of these hallucinogens at some point. And what happened is that it started spreading because people were enjoying this in the 1950s, 60s, etc. And that is the thing that caused the problem because of the widespread use. And the consequences that there was a general malaise in society where people started finding their jobs a bit boring, lifeless, etc., because these hallucinogens had given them this feeling of what could be great fun. And now everyday life was just a bit too boring. And so that had an impact on society, or some aspects of society, and that wasn't seen well by the people who ran society. And the result of that was that the FDA in the States stopped research projects in 1965, and they said, nope, we don't like this. It's a problem. And then governments worldwide started to ban the drugs in 1971. So we have this usage from the 1950s spreading, and then people enjoying them, but as a result of them enjoying them, not enjoying everyday life, which was causing problems at some levels of society. And then eventually it resulted in this ban. And that's where things start getting a bit complicated. And this is a graph that Francesco created for me, which is the number of publications with research on psychedelic drugs from the 1960s to 2020. And you see that in 1960, there were about, say, 20 papers published. But then by 1970, let's say, this had gone to 100. So there was a five-fold increase, and there was a peak in the early 1970s. But then things started going downhill. Now, the reason for this was Nixon's war on drugs. Once this war on drugs had been declared and other governments around the world started banning the use of the drugs, that meant that any research on the drugs wasn't being funded. And that meant that researchers couldn't continue the research. The peak for a couple of years after that is because of the horrors of academic publishing, that it takes a few years to get our work published. So that work that you see in 72, 73, that's work that will have been funded back in 1970. And then what you see is that drop down again to just before the 1990s, because it was not easy to do research there. Now, the interesting thing is that things started improving in 1990s. And why was that? So what made this rediscovery of psychedelics? It was the internet. Because people could now talk to one another, that meant that people who were using these substances, which were illegal, could at least find ways to talk about them, and maybe even find ways to get them. And people could freely talk about their experiences in a way that before they were all isolated, and because there wasn't any research going on, we couldn't work out what was happening. And there were forums which had an anonymity, so people could freely talk openly and honestly about what they were experiencing. And although it wasn't controlled research, it meant that information was being exchanged about what to do, what not to do, what was good, what was bad, etc. And then finally, legal highs started being created, where scientists who knew how these drugs worked started creating molecules that from these drugs, which they could synthesize and rearrange to become legal drugs. Now, that is a whole thing in itself, which I'm not going to even touch, but basically there's a way of synthesizing the active substance in these drugs and rearranging them to get most of the benefit. So what we see is that the war on drugs created this big blow for drug research or psychedelic drug research in the 1970s, and that tailed off for about 20 years. But then the internet and the availability of exchange of information and anonymity meant that people who were still taking the drugs, because these things are still there, they don't disappear just because of laws, people could talk about them, and that's what caused the resurgence. Now, why are we interested in them if they were so bad for society in the 1950s and 60s? Well, this is where we turn to mental health. And these are statistics from Mind, which is a charity that works with people with mental health problems. And these are statistics for the UK and their specific diagnosis in any given week. So how many people are diagnosed in every week? What we find is that 6 in 100 people are diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. Four out of 100 are diagnosed each week for post-traumatic stress disorder. 3 people in 100 every week diagnosed with depression, and about 2 in 100 might end up with a diagnosis, a lifetime diagnosis. So this isn't a one-off, a lifetime diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Now, these statistics will keep changing because as research improves and also as society becomes more willing to accept that there are problems in society that cause mental health problems, more people will be willing to come out and admit that they've got these problems. So part of it is just society's willingness to accept that these problems exist results in more people being open about suffering. And the suffering is there. So why is that important? Well, the reason it's important is because while it's possible to help some of these people with standard pharmaceutical drugs for depression, etc., it doesn't help everyone. Now, statistics suggest that treatment-resistant depression, which is where someone's depression is so severe that it just doesn't respond to talking therapy, which is psychological therapy, or drug therapy. The people for whom these treatments just don't work, it affects about 1 in 3 adults in the States who've suffered at least one major depressive disorder. So standard forms of treatment do not help about 1/3 of the people who've suffered at least one major depressive disorder, depressive episode, which is quite alarming given how much, what the rate of depression is in the Western Hemisphere, in the Western world. And this is a quote from Saad al-Harbi, which is that patients with major depression respond to antidepressant treatment, but 10 to 30% of them do not improve or show a partial response, coupled with functional impairment, poor quality of life, suicide ideation and attempts, self-injurious behavior, and a high relapse rate. So there are people who respond well to drug treatment or psychological treatment, and that's great. It's great that there are people for whom this works. But it's pretty clear that there are some people for whom this just doesn't work. And I've spoken in the past about how mindfulness meditation is really useful. There are forms of mindfulness meditation that have been developed for people who've suffered from more than 2 or 3 episodes of the clinical depression. So what we have is that society is facing this fact that there are people for whom the current treatments just don't work. So why does that become important? Well, the thing is that the drugs that I talked to you about before, the psychedelic drugs, seem to be helping people. So I'll tell you a bit about the different types of psychedelics and their effects. And this will be a real skate through because I'm not an expert, but I just wanted to give you a general sense. The first type I want to talk about are known as serotogenic hallucinogens. And the main one that people know of is LSD. And the effects of LSD are that someone becomes very analytical, they become quite fast-paced and intense, they find life easier to handle. And there are different types of LSD drugs. They're all part of this family of drugs. LSD is just one of them. And the potential for abuse is pretty low. So LSD has the specific effects on people, and that easier to handle life and things like that is one particular nice effect. The next type are known as serotogenic hallucinogens, and these are the classic one. An example is magic mushrooms. There's a particular substance called psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in these magic mushrooms. And the effects are that people end up feeling a bit spiritual, they find it soothing, they become more emotional, they can end up getting this real warmth as a result of taking these drugs, these magic mushrooms. Others can be extremely intense because mushrooms come in many varieties, and so some will be more intense than others. So there are quite a wide range of effects, but there's a low potential for abuse. So it's the impression is that you don't get as addicted to them. Then the final set are known as dissociative hallucinogens. And the classic one that is known about is ketamine, but there are others such as PCP or nitrous oxide. I don't know anything about these things really. I just know that it's one of the classes of drugs. And the effects is that people can start talk just nonsense. They feel a sense of connectedness and peaceful, although not everyone. They can have a powerful calming effect. Some can have great effects, but some can also have quite negative effects. So with PCP, some people can experience a mania and a psychosis. So importantly, these drugs have lots of different effects, and the effects vary depending on the strengths of them, and the effects are different on different people. And this is one of the challenges in this type of work. It's how to work out who can take them in a safe manner. So could they be used in mental health? Because the story I'm trying to tell you here is that we've got a societal problem with mental health, and we know that the current pharmaceutical drugs that have been developed over the decades are good for some people, but for 30% of people, they might not be touching the sides. So given the positive effects of some of these psychedelic drugs, could we use them for people with mental health problems? So this is a study just from 2018, so very recent, about a single dose of intravenous ketamine. And in this study, what this group of researchers did was to look at people's suicidal ideation. So that's about people's thoughts about suicide, not attempts, but thoughts about suicide. I'm not going to go into the details because they're not important. The main thing is that they took people who they gave this intravenous ketamine to, and they had a control group. So a control group is the group that doesn't get the the treatment. They're injected with a placebo where they don't know what they've got, but it's a harmless substance. What you have on the x-axis along the bottom is baseline, which is before they started, then after day 1, day 2, day 3, and then a week later. And along the y-axis, along the side, we've got clinically reported suicidal ideation. So how many thoughts of suicide a person had on a day. And you see at the start, or at baseline, both groups, the ketamine and the control group, were having about 3 suicidal thoughts a day. The control group, they went down to maybe 2.5. They have a few less, but even by 7 days later, they are still having about 2.25 suicidal thoughts a day. Whereas the ketamine group, they dropped from 3 suicidal thoughts a day to 1.25 after a day of the intravenous ketamine. What you see is that things tail off a bit, but those little asterisks above some of the symbols, that means that there's a statistically significant difference. So basically, what this graph suggests is that the ketamine group, they ended up having significantly fewer suicidal thoughts compared to people who didn't get the ketamine. So this is rather promising work, because it suggests that people who had real problems with how they were feeling reduced in their thoughts about suicide. Now, one of the problems with work like this, and any work in an area like this, is expectation by people, and also how you make sure that this is a controlled study. Now, it may have been that the people in the ketamine group just wanted to feel better, and there was some sort of effect of a placebo that they wanted to get better, and so they thought they were getting better. So the thing to do in studies like this is to have random allocation, and having people in trials where they can't tell what's going to happen to them, or in terms of they can't guess whether they've got the placebo or the drug itself. And this is a really interesting study. I think it was from an Australian group, but I'm not sure. What they did is that they got 70 people who were willing to take part in a study with psilocybin. So that's the drug from magic mushrooms. And it was assisted therapy. So they don't just give them the psilocybin, there's therapy along with the psilocybin. And these are people who had a major depressive disorder. And importantly, it was a randomized clinical trial. So they had 70 people like that who had major depressive disorder. 43 of those people, they were disqualified from participating for various reasons, because they wanted to make sure that the group that went through to the study were as clean as possible in terms of what they could conclude from their results. So they had 27 people who fully qualified for the trial. They put 15 into one group, 12 into another group. One group got immediate treatment, followed by no treatment. The other group had delayed treatment, so they didn't have anything, but then they did get the treatment. And the idea here is to make sure that everyone does get the treatment. It's just that one group waits for a while, and you can try to work out whether the treatment itself has an impact. And here are the results. So along the x-axis, you've got baseline, which is where everyone started the study, then weeks 5 and 8. after they started the study with having the psilocybin-assisted therapy. Along the y-axis, along the side, what you've got is a particular depression rating. So remember, these people had major depressive disorder. At baseline, what you find at the start is that both groups had exactly the same depression score. So 25 or something, 23 or something like that. What you see with the immediate group, the group that started on the treatment straight away, is that by week 5, they've already reduced in their depression score from about 23 to about 8. And at week 8, that has not changed much. So we've got this rapid decrease in depression score compared to the group who had delayed treatment. That delayed treatment group, the black dots, black circles, they did get the treatment. It's just that they had to wait so that they could work out whether it was the treatment itself or just being part of the study. Then what they did is that after everyone had had the treatment, they combined them. And here you can see the baseline, post-session after week 1 and post-session after week 4. So this is, post-session means after the treatment is completely finished. So let's say it was an 8-week treatment. They then went back a week after that treatment had ended and 4 weeks after the treatment had ended. And what you see rather nicely is that that reduction in depression scores has been maintained overall. So even though that delayed group in the first graph still had the same depression score, that was because they weren't being treated. What that suggests is that once they started the psilocybin, even they reduced in their depression scores so that you get that combined result at the end there. Now, any of you who are into statistics will then appreciate the statement that Francesco gave me, that people with major depression showed a reduction in symptoms of 2 standard deviations, which is unheard of for common depression. Now, 2 standard deviations is a huge change in how much the depression score has gone down. If you don't understand it, don't worry. But the big thing is that this wasn't a small drop in depression scores. It was a massive drop in depression scores. And it was in a randomized trial where everything was controlled really well. So, and this study was only done in 2020. So it's really fresh, which suggests that we're getting to that point where with something like psilocybin, we're beginning to see the impact that it could have with depressive disorder. Now, more recently, also in 2020, but I think it came out in November, there's been what's known as a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is where these researchers, who are based mainly in Wisconsin in the States, they've gathered together all the papers that are available by all researchers in the world. So there's a systematic way in which you can gather all of the published papers, and you create very objective criteria for analyzing them so that you can compare them and do a like for like. And this particular study or paper does this review and analysis where they summarize everything. And effectively, what they're finding is that psilocybin does seem to, in general, across all of the studies that they looked at, seems to reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression. So these are early findings, but they're really promising. And that is really hopeful for those people who experience drug-resistant depression, anxiety, etc. So just in terms of why these psychedelic drugs might be having and making these differences, there must be something going on. And this is research by a group who, I think this group might be, actually I think this group is in San Diego. And what they're looking at is neuronal growth. So those neurons that are passing messages from one part of the brain to the other, they looked at these neurons in animals that had been given these particular drugs, because they just wanted to look at what's happening at the neuronal level. And what they found, the details aren't important, but in the animals, they will have given them a placebo, which they call a vehicle, and they give them the drug, which is either the ketamine in red or the LSD in blue. And what they looked at is synapse density. And synapses are those relay stations that I talked about at the beginning, and you saw in the little video where the first neuron relays to the second neuron. Now, synapse density is basically how many of those synapses are created, because what happens is that the way our neurons function, they can keep growing. And the main takeaway message is that both the ketamine and the LSD resulted in greater synaptic growth following administration. And these are electron micrograph photographs of single neurons. Now, these things are minuscule, but they can photograph them. You've got the vehicle, which is where the animals didn't have any of the drug whatsoever, a representative ketamine one and a representative LSD one. And what you see there is effectively just more sprouting. So it's like a plant that grows more roots. And if it grows more roots, it's going to get more water and nutrients from the soil. In the same way here, with these, with more of these dendrites, as they're called, which are little arms, each of those dendrites can then create a synapse with another cell. So the more of these dendrites, which is like the roots, the more you can create links to other cells. And given that we know that at that synaptic junction, that's where drugs can have an impact, you can be improving the likelihood of this serotonin and the dopamine and all of those chemicals that we have in our bodies already. It allows those chemicals to have a greater impact. So of course, we don't know for certain that this happens in humans because this was done in animals, but it's really promising results because it suggests that the way that these drugs are working is that they're increasing the density of these neurons. They're becoming more complex, they're creating more links, and those links are allowing for greater transmission of this serotonin and dopamine, which are extremely strongly implicated in our mood and well-being. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about psychedelic assisted therapy, because the message here isn't to go out and just grab some magic mushrooms or just score some LSD. This is about using this in controlled environment. And that's what psychedelic assisted therapy is. So this is someone getting intravenous ketamine. So this is where it's fully controlled in a hospital setting. They're given a particular dosage. It's all monitored, it's clean, etc., etc. This is an intranasal spray of one of the forms of ketamine called S-ketamine, I think it is. And this one is actually the only one of all of the things I'm telling you about which has got an FDA approval in the States. So this is an intranasal spray that people can spray themselves, but in controlled conditions. Then there's the actual therapy that will go along with some of these treatments. It doesn't happen with the ketamine one, but this one with the psilocybin, where you have talking therapy, which is basically like counseling, where the patient has had the drug, the psilocybin, but the idea is to then use the fact that they're able to relax and open up more to engage more with therapy in a way that they might not be able to. So this would be the room of someone who's having this type of therapy, and it would be very intensive. Now, importantly, because of the different formats and the different things involved, there are different costs. So, as you can imagine, staying at a center in your own room, having talking therapy, which isn't just a one off, is going to be more expensive than having an intravenous ketamine given to you, but without someone giving you 8 sessions of therapy. So there are costs involved, and those obviously mean that it's going to be difficult to give to everyone, but at least it's a starting point. The final issue I want to talk about is microdosing. And microdosing is regular ingestion of very small quantities of psychedelic substances. And it's in such small quantities that it's not supposed to cause any psychedelic effect. So none of the kind of spiritual, emotional feelings, etc., that are usually associated with psychedelic drugs. So the idea is very small amounts which don't hit a threshold for creating the effects that are usually associated. Now, these are reported to cause long-term benefits in well-being and health, and that's what people have said, that if you have very small quantities, then excuse the typo, then you can improve your well-being and health, and has become very popular in recent years. But very importantly, there isn't much empirical evidence for this yet. So these are what people report anecdotally, that if they have just very small amounts of these psychedelic drugs, amounts that don't give them the classic highs that are associated with them, they report therapeutic benefits in their general well-being and health. But studies are needed. There is a study that's come out from Australia, from the Macquarie University, which was a systematic study of microdosing psychedelics, and they've suggested the benefit, and this was published in February 2019. But then later in the same year, in November 2019, this review paper was published, asking whether we're just ending up with more questions than answers. So this is quite an important paper, because it's important to also look at the negatives. So we can't just say, oh, this is great, and start using it. And importantly, the last name there, David Nutt, he's a major figure in this world. And so it's quite important that he's involved in this work. And this brings me to one of my final points that I want to make, which is about drug-related mortality. Because one of the issues with drugs is this fear of what they're doing to us. And David Nutt, in a book that he's published, and I'll show you an example at the book in a moment, he's looked at various drugs and compared them to other drugs and looked at what they cause. Now, here he's taken cocaine, which in the UK might have 700,000 users, and compared it to tobacco, which has got 7 million users. And what you see is deaths per year. You get about 250 deaths per year in England and Wales attributed to cocaine, whereas deaths attributed to tobacco because of lung diseases, et cetera, is 100,000 a year. So that's like 400 times more than cocaine. There are all sorts of issues involved. If we go down to one of the lower issues at the bottom, economic cost, he says that it's hard to estimate the economic cost of cocaine use, but it's not more than 50 million a year. Whereas the economic cost of tobacco and the problems it causes is 13 billion a year. Taking another example, and I love this next example of his, is comparing ecstasy use to horse riding. And here what he's done is he's looked at the fact that there might be 60 million uses of ecstasy in a year in the UK. And so that's people who take it multiple times. So it's not 60 million users, but 60 million pills are taken a year in the UK. And that causes about 10 to 50 deaths per year. Whereas there are 2 million episodes of horse riding and there's 10 deaths per year. So what he's doing here is to show that we've got 60 million usages of ecstasy and 10 to 50 deaths, whereas horse riding, which has got 2 million episodes, if you multiplied that by 30, you'd have the same number of episodes as ecstasy, and you've got a similar number of deaths. And the point here is simply that everyone thinks of these drugs as causing a lot of bad problems. But in fact, maybe they're not causing, in a like-for-like way, the amount of problems that people think they are. And with a group, he's created a table, and this is his book, Drugs Without the Hot Air. So this is where he's basically trying to demystify things to do with alcohol, smoking, intravenous drug use, abuse of pharmaceuticals, and marijuana. And this is an independent panel that looked at 20 drugs and gave them a score on a scale of 0 to 100 for drug-related mortality. And they had lots of criteria for deciding this. And they've rated them from no harm at all, 0, to most harm, 100. We have LSD at the bottom. So there's very little harm caused by LSD. We've got magic mushrooms, not much more. Maybe the score is at under 10. Ketamine might be about 20. So there's a bit of problem there. Look at alcohol and tobacco. So alcohol and tobacco are way more harmful to us than the drugs that, the psychedelic drugs that seem to have such a bad rap. So this is kind of like a systematic or a meta-analysis where he's tried to put, or he and this panel of experts have tried to compare like for like. And when you compare like for like, alcohol and tobacco are much more harmful than the 3 psychedelic drugs that I've been talking to you about this evening. So, in summary, psychedelic drugs are not new. They've been around for a while. And although they were driven underground by the drug laws in the 1970s, the use has increased over the last few decades. And research is beginning to demonstrate that they could be beneficial if used appropriately for people with various different mental health problems, particularly those who are resistant to standard pharmaceutical medication. More controlled research is obviously needed to evaluate these initial results, and most importantly, to ensure patient safety, because we can't have people running off and trying these things out if there are reasons that they shouldn't. Because some of these drugs, they really should not be taken by certain groups, particularly people with schizophrenia. There's a whole sort of exclusion criteria for using these drugs. So it's very important that they're used under controlled conditions by research centers that know what they're doing. And one way for this, to improve this, is for governments to reconsider classification of some drugs so that at least researchers can use them legally for conducting research. Now, there are many centers around the world that are doing this. In London, we have Imperial College, which is, I think, where David Nutt is, King's College, at the Institute of Psychiatry. In the States, there's Johns Hopkins. There's many different centers, and I think my team has got a list of centers that they can provide in the chat if anyone is interested in finding out. Now, given that he is the man, the guru, I thought that he should have the last word. So this is a lovely TEDx talk that he gave where he summarizes things.
And we've been able to utilize this liberation of processing of the brain produced by psychedelics to treat people with depression. So here's a study published last year where we took people with depression who failed 2 previous antidepressant treatments and also had failed psychotherapy. And they were given a single dose of psilocybin. And you can see there that a week later, all of them had recovered to some extent, and half of them were now in a state of remission. They were in the yellow bar there, which shows that their depression had actually gone away. And that's not the first evidence that psychedelics have therapy or have therapeutic uses. We also have evidence from around the world that psilocybin can be useful in helping people deal with alcohol dependence, with smoking dependence, with obsessive compulsive disorder. And most recently, 2 major studies showing it can help people come to terms with the anxiety and the depression, which almost always accompanies a diagnosis of a terminal illness. So these drugs can have potentially enormous opportunities for helping people deal with mental distress. And it's not just psychedelics that can have that potential. Many illegal drugs have medical uses. So for non-psychedelics, there's MDMA, ecstasy, where there's good evidence in post-traumatic stress disorder, and also some studies going on in addiction. And of course, there's cannabis, where we have a range of different disorders from pain, spasticity, cancer, epilepsy, inflammatory diseases, and also sleep disorders. All of these potentially are amenable to treatment with cannabis. So why don't we use these drugs? And that's because the WHO and the United Nations have said they're too dangerous, which is certainly untrue. I can tell you categorically, none of our patients died in the experiments we did on them. Most of our governments perpetuate this lie. And many of us, hopefully not you, have got closed minds. We do not want to believe that these might have therapeutic utility. So I want to say to you now, surely now you, if not everyone, should accept the fact that these drugs potentially could be very important medicines. And for the sake of the millions of people in the world who could be helped, it's time to say there should be no limits to the therapeutic research we do with these drugs. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the guru. This is his book, Drugs Without the Hot Air. So if you're interested in this, then I would highly recommend it. Okay, so to finally just say that if you want to take part in our research, do get in touch with us, to my research team at art.goal.mind@gmail.com. Include the following information: name, age, gender, any neurological condition or cognitive difficulty or even strength. We work in quite a few different areas: memory, face recognition, executive functions, which is how the front of the brain works. Recently, we've started work on aphantasia and may work in synesthesia. And we're particularly interested in getting into the psychedelic drug area because of the work that my team does on the way that the front of the brain manages behavior. Because the work we've done with an assessment that I've created using virtual reality, we think might be able to unlock some of the benefits and work out what are the benefits of taking these drugs. So if anyone who's listening is involved in this sort of work, please do get in touch with us, because Oscar and I definitely want to do some work in that area. You can find out more about my research team by visiting our webpage. And if your organization would like me to give a talk on any of the subjects that I've spoken about during these 3 series, then you can contact me directly and I can discuss giving a talk to your organization. So thank you very much for your patience and for putting up with the delay. As for the next talk, who knows, because I'm quite tired. It takes me quite a lot of effort to get this talk ready, and I have to work on it all Friday and Saturday after doing a full week's work. So we need to know whether you want more talks, and in about 10 or 15 minutes time, my team will be posting a survey on the Facebook chat, and we'd like you to complete that survey since we want to know whether you'd like more talks, and if so, what sort of areas you'd like to have more talks on. And as has become tradition, I'm going to end with a photograph of my mummy. So this is my mummy with a giant tortoise on Prisoner Island in Zanzibar, where she was born. She wasn't born in Prisoner Island, she was born in Zanzibar. But Prisoner Island is this tiny little island where they used to keep prisoners. And now they have these giant tortoises. And I think this boy was about 120 years old. So this is a lovely picture when we took mum back to Zanzibar. She was only 3 when my grandfather moved the family from Zanzibar to Kenya, and then we took her back about 66 years later. So this is mummy with her tortoise. Well, not her tortoise, but one she met. So thank you very much. I'm now going to go and freshen up, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Please post your questions into the chat, and I'll come back and start answering them. Thank you. Okay, I'm back. I'm going to see if any questions have come in. I'm waiting to see, are there any questions? At the moment, I'm not seeing any. If not, then it means that I get to sign off more quickly. No, I'm being told there aren't any questions. So either no one was listening or people didn't find it interesting, or I've answered all the questions in my talk already. So I'm going to sit here and continue drinking, well, start drinking my wine left over from my birthday. Oh, Julian Bishop, wonderful man who I know, has asked, I'd like to know how far back in human evolution the VTA goes and whether it is possible it evolved with psilocybin. I doubt it very much, Julian, that it evolved with psilocybin. I think the VTA, we know, was found by work with rats by a very famous pair called Olds and Milner. And what they did is that they were trying to work out, how do we learn and what is it that makes us do more of something? And this is part of a big tradition in behaviorism, when we were trying to work out what is reward in the brain and how do we learn. And the way that this was done was by studying animals and looking at their behavior. And in this particular work, what they did was to find particular areas of the brain, and they attached electrodes to those. So these were invasive studies, but the animal was still alive, and it could still eat and enjoy, and etc. And they stimulated different areas of the brain. And the way that they did it is that they created a system where the animal was in a little box and there's a lever. And if they pressed the lever, it got a little zap in through the electrode. And what they found is that when the electrode was moved to different areas, the amount that the animal eventually started pressing this bar, because it would just be wandering around in its little cage, and at some point it would bump up against this bar and would get a bit of a zzz. And if it liked that zzz, eventually it would learn, every time I go near that bar and touch it, I get a zzz. So it would eventually learn, if I hit that bar, I'm going to get what I want. And by doing that, they were able to locate the reward center, which is this VTA. And what that suggested to them from the behavior of the animal was that there's a part of the brain which, if it's stimulated, it wants more. And that's why they call it the reward area. And that is the VTA. Now, the animal the mouse wasn't going around looking for psilocybin. It is a mammalian area of the brain, and it's evolved for some sort of reward. And as I said, food, sex, etc., all of that seems to activate that particular area of the brain. So the VTA isn't a human thing, it is a mammalian thing, and it certainly wouldn't have come about through anything to do with psilocybin, I'm afraid. Okay, are there any more questions? Let's see. Apparently Kevin asks good questions, but I haven't been sent Kevin's questions yet. So I'm waiting for someone to, oh, Oscar is typing them in. Oh, so Kevin Kwok has said, where are you from, Kevin? Your name rings a bell. I see it in the list of attendees, but I don't know where you are, Kevin. Kevin's question is, why do 30% of people with chronic depression not respond to typical pharmaceutical treatment? And why is psilocybin potentially more effective? What is the mechanism of action, and are they long-term? Now, in terms of the mechanism of action and the long-termness, it's too early to tell, because as I showed you, those studies are only in the last couple of years, and with major depression that's recurrent, it might be a couple of years before it comes back again. So we're still too early in that time frame to be able to know how long-term that benefit is. In terms of why 30% don't respond to pharmaceutical treatments, that's a really good question. The thing is, no one knows. And the point of that is that what we're finding in human psychology is that we give names to particular behaviors or abilities because it's a term that can be really useful when we're starting out to understand something. But then as we start studying it more and more, what we realize is that that catch-all term that we might have created is too generic. Now, I'll give you an example from neuropsychology, which is the study of people with brain damage, that the first patient that was really studied was someone in Paris in the 1800s who couldn't speak anymore. He could understand language, he could see, he could remember, etc., but he couldn't create language. And that problem of speaking became known as aphasia. And there's lots of research because this aphasia is quite common after a particular type of stroke if it hit this area of the brain. As more and more research happened, people started understanding more about this language function and ability. But then what happened is that at some point, researchers started seeing that the results from their studies were getting a bit gray and a bit mushy, and they weren't making sense. And part of this was because they were realizing that they were digging really deep into this condition and realizing that what they saw as one condition was actually many different conditions. And so this term aphasia, it's a very generic catch-all term, and you can have 5 people who've got this overall label, but they've got really different types of language disorder. And we see this over and over again in human behavior, in cognition. So for example, dyslexia is, people use that term all the time, but there's so many different types of dyslexia. Autism is another one that at one point, everyone was really happy that we'd found out a reason why some children don't communicate as well as other children. And so this term autism came about. But then over time, it became very apparent that there were different types of autism. And I think that what we have in depression is the same thing, that we have a general description of a mood and a behavior, which is low mood, and a behavior pattern of not doing things, lethargy, etc., which has been given this umbrella term, depression. But in fact, it's probably many different things. And it may be that the people who have milder forms that do respond quite quickly to drugs or to talking therapies, counseling, etc., that they've got one of the families of depression, whereas other people have got a different type of depression. And it may be that the people who are drug resistant, they've got a particular type of depression that the current drugs can't touch. And that doesn't mean that there won't be drug treatment for it, just that at the moment, the types of drug treatments that I used, again, in that synapse area, that we haven't yet found that. So I think that it's probably because those people are suffering from a different type of depression. It's linked, but I think it's not just a slightly more complex version. But I'm not a therapist, so I can't say that for certain, but I do think that it's probably something to do with that. I think that in their biochemistry and the fact that there's so many different types of antidepressants is because some of them, each of them are working slightly differently on that synaptic cleft area where that relay station is. And it may be that there's different families of problems in terms of what's happening at that relay station, and that the people with the major depressive disorder, they've got a particular problem at that junction, which doesn't respond as well to the current drugs. But that is an intuition. It's not something that I know for certain. Okay, Simon Dunn, Kitchen Dunn in Suffolk, I think it is, has asked when and where can he get LSD therapy? I don't know, I'm afraid. Certainly you can find out from Imperial College and King's College in London. They're the people who do research in it. But in terms of where you can get it, I'm afraid I don't know. But maybe someone in my team can provide some information in the chat, because as I said, Andrea, Francesco, and Oscar, they're my go-to people in this area. Okay. One thing that Oscar said in response to Kevin is that maybe the people with the chronic depression don't respond because it's hard to get out of a particular mindset. Psychedelics are able to take the restraint of the mind to change the perspective and view the self in a different light. So maybe it's not pulling them enough out of, psychedelics are able to pull them out of the mindset, whereas maybe the conventional drugs are not able to. And one of the things for anyone who's suffered that type of depression is actually being able to view yourself in a different way. So pulling yourself out of the mindset probably can't happen with the conventional drugs for those people, and maybe the psychedelics are able to at least release them from that mindset. So that is Oscar's answer to that question. Jane Croucher, superfan, is asking me a very controversial question. Naughty you, Jane. Jane has asked, would you ban alcohol smoking and horse riding, or should everything be allowed? Oh, I'm not a politician. I wouldn't ban any of those things. I think we just have to become more, informed and have informed choice. I don't have a problem with horse riding. I'm not particularly interested in it. I don't have a problem with alcohol, but I don't want to overdo it, and I don't smoke. I'll have a drag of someone else's cigarette, maybe. I think it's everything in moderation. I think one of the things that I didn't talk about today is that there are lots of issues that surround this area which I have no knowledge of, and I'm sure David Nutt has got lots of thoughts about this. is that why has the tobacco industry got such a stranglehold on governments and the alcohol industry? They're getting a lot of money, and there's something about the finances involved here. And I'm pretty sure in my readings, maybe from Oscar or from Andrea, that it is possible to develop some of these psychedelic drugs in medical grade relatively cheaply. The thing is that's not good for the pharmaceutical industry. If we can create some of these psychedelic drugs in a way that can help people really easily, then that takes away a huge chunk of business for these companies. And of course, it's a controversial thing to say, but the pharmaceutical industry might not be that interested in having all of these problems go away. So there are probably some lobbies going on, which mean that alcohol and smoking are perfectly legitimate, even though, according to David Nutt and his people, they are causing such problems. Whereas LSD, ketamine, the psilocybin, etc., which could have potential therapeutic benefits, they don't have a lobby behind them. Now, I'm not a politician, so I can't say much there, but I wouldn't ban those things. I think we should allow other things that could potentially be of help. I'd be interested to know what you think, Jane. So Kevin, he's actually in Australia. No, he's from Australia, but he's in London. Do the pharmaceutical treatments usually target the apparent brain chemical imbalances, maybe say by targeting dopamine or serotonin, rather than addressing the root cause of the problem? Sort of symptom management, absolutely, Kevin, and that's one of the big issues in the mental health world, that drugs alone do not take away these problems. Drugs are dealing with the symptoms, and what that allows is for someone who's suffering from anxiety or from depression to actually manage to deal with the underlying causes. Now, there are some people, I don't know the area again, but there are some people who just chemically just go on a dip, and they need to be on the drugs because maybe just chemically they've got depleted serotonin or dopamine. But most other people, their depression comes on because of what's called a life event. A life event is something that happens to you. Loss of a relationship, loss of job, stress in your life, etc. And this is where the psychological models of depression are really important, that there's a tipping point where eventually the system can't handle it, and that's when you fall down into this well of depression or anxiety. And what the pharmaceutical drugs are doing is taking the edge off of that to allow the person to address the issues. And that's why research, certainly when I was a student, and I'm sure that it's probably similar now, research demonstrated that drugs on their own had some effect, but not completely. Talking therapies, so psychological therapy, do have an impact, but the best is a combination of the two. And that's because the drugs allow the person, as Oscar said, to get out of a particular mindset, and then they can engage with the psychological therapy to talk about the things that have happened to them that have brought them into that low mood. And so, like you say in your message, that psilocybin perhaps allows people to tap into the unconscious side of their trauma. I don't know about the unconscious side, because that's something that is a tricky concept, because by virtue of the word unconscious, we don't know what's there. I think what Oscar said was very important, that it allows people to get out of that mindset. So it's kind of like the pharmaceuticals, but the pharmaceuticals aren't able to take the edge off. So if a person is in such a low mood that they can't even engage with a conversation with a therapist, then they're not going to be able to benefit from the work that the therapist can do with them. And maybe the psilocybin is taking that edge off, which is allowing the therapist to get in there to help them deal with their issue. So I don't know if it's about the unconscious. I think it's more about getting to a space where it's possible to actually, engage with the psychological therapy. Because ultimately, unless it's a chemically driven imbalance that causes the low mood, it's going to be life events or particular thought processes, and those thought processes aren't going to go away because of psilocybin or Prozac or something like that. Okay, Oscar has said in response to Simon that to try to get LSD therapy, you'd have to sign up for studies, and that's the issue. That's what David Nutt is saying, that at the moment it's really difficult to do research, because whereas if I'm doing research on a particular issue, I can just send out an email and just say, would you like to get involved in XYZ research? And because the areas that I work in are cognitive, to do with memory, etc., I can just use anyone. But David Nutt needs people who are taking psilocybin or etc. And if it's not legal, then it's difficult for him to get participants. So then he has to do this very controlled research, which is good, that's controlled research. But then getting the funding for that controlled research is really difficult, and there's only so much you can do in a research study where there's a high cost, etc. So we need people to sign up to studies, but we basically need governments to allow more studies to happen by funding studies. Okay, any more questions? I can enjoy my wine while we're waiting for questions. I hope that the team has sent out the feedback form, because it would be nice to get feedback from people. As I said, I'm not planning a talk for next week because I need a break. I need to sort out my flat. But I am interested in doing I'm happy to do other talks, but I need to have ideas for those talks, and I'm running out of ideas. So Andrea has told me that there are no more questions. So I hope that the talk and its content and the information that I've provided you, thanks to those three wonderful people, Andrea, Oscar, and Francesco, that the information has been useful and interesting. And I hope that there's been a good discussion on the chat, which I haven't yet seen, but I'll look at later on. And hopefully we will see each other again. As the Queen said in her speech recently, we'll meet again. I'm just waiting for one final message from Claudia. I think it's to tell me that we can officially close. No, I think we're done. Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing from people and to the next talk. Take care and see you soon. Bye.